Is human rights law applicable in all armed conflicts? In recent days, discussions have intensified around the question of whether human rights law applies in all armed conflicts. This topic is particularly relevant as global events unfold, highlighting the importance of legal protections during warfare. Many people are searching for clarity on how these laws interact and what protections exist for civilians and combatants alike. Human rights law and international humanitarian law operate in related but distinct spheres during armed conflicts. The fundamental framework of international humanitarian law, including the Geneva Conventions and the laws of armed conflict, specifically governs conduct during and the protection of civilians, prisoners of war, and other persons affected by hostilities. International humanitarian law is designed to regulate the conduct of hostilities and to protect persons who are not or are no longer participating in hostilities. It applies specifically to international armed conflicts and, to a certain extent, non-international armed conflicts. This body of law sets rules on the treatment of civilians, detainees, and combatants. The Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols form the core of these rules. Human rights law remains applicable during armed conflicts, but may be subject to certain limitations or derogations allowed under specific circumstances. For example, some rights may be restricted during states of emergency or armed conflict. However, fundamental protections such as the right to life and the prohibition of torture remains in force. The enforcement and applicability of human rights law in conflict zones depend on the capacity and willingness of states and other actors to respect these obligations. The United Nations and other international bodies have documented violations of both international humanitarian law and human rights law in conflict situations. Reports on conflicts highlight abuses such as unlawful killings, torture, forced displacement, and violations against civilians and prisoners of war, which breach both sets of laws. International human rights mechanisms often call for accountability and protection measures alongside the enforcement of international humanitarian law standards. Human rights law applies in all armed conflicts alongside international humanitarian law, but the scope and enforcement may differ. International humanitarian law provides specific rules tailored for war situations, while human rights law continues to protect individuals' fundamental rights throughout, including during hostilities. Both bodies of law aim to protect human dignity and reduce suffering in times of war, with overlapping and complementary roles in safeguarding civilians and combatants alike.